All was quiet in the village of Gummalapur when Raghu awoke next to his wife. He thought he heard a noise, but maybe not. Sitting up, he surveyed his humble abode, and everything seemed to be in order. But of course, that's exactly what she'd want him to think. It was easy to be jumpy these days, or rather, these nights, for the killer that stalked their streets only came out at night. And though it was dark outside, it was darker inside, and the family that lived in the thatched hut dared not draw attention to themselves with the teasing glow of an oil lamp, because Shaitan was not deterred by indications of humanity. She was attracted to them. It had been 6 days since ebbing screams permeated the village. 6 days since the Shaitan, the demon, had claimed a victim. The time elapsed was not a good thing, quite the contrary, for every day that passed uneventfully was another day that the Shaitan's hunger swelled, another day closer to when the beast would feed. Raghu knew that the odds of Shaitan selecting his domicile were low, but certainly not zero. Never zero. Warily and wearily, he laid his head against the pillow and was about to cradle his wife when he heard something else, and this time, the something was certainly not nothing. A patter as faint as the pitter that preceded it. Under normal circumstances, such a noise wouldn't even register, but not here and not now, because this beast took great care to imitate nothing. The noise was unmistakable, claws on thatching, tearing, pulling, something that to us might sound vaguely like a cat at a scratching post, but to him sounded distinctly like the worst-case scenario. Quiet but consistent breaths, randomly punctuated by curious grunts and gurgles, like a lockpick amusing over his trade. Probing tugs and thoughtful prodding, rustling like the strumming of a sitar from another world, a rumble and a faint snarl all at once. Raghu didn't cry out, he didn't shout or scream, and he didn't alert his family sleeping beside him. He'd heard anecdotes from witnesses to the previous takings, and they all agreed that displaying awareness of Shaitan, or trying to drive her off, only fortified her resolve, and made her act all the faster, lest she lose her opportunity for the night. And he also knew that this particular leopard was notorious for being selective and particular, often not liking what it sees and moving on, studying dozens of potential targets before selecting one, just as he himself would look over produce at a market before selecting the choice fruit. Other than that, his only hope was that by some miracle, the leopard would decide against his hut, perhaps thinking it vacant, or perhaps finding the roof too formidable. But unfortunately, this place was not one known for its miracles, and by no metric could his life be counted as a lucky one. He gripped his machete tightly, praying for the thing to leave, not yet daring to look. Perhaps Shaitan would stay a myth if he didn't see it. He heard one more scratching pull, and then unbroken silence. Slowly, as not to draw attention to himself, Raghu rolled to face the source of the noise, and 8 feet above him, his fears were confirmed, for a spotted face peered through the hole that the beast had torn. It stared directly at Prisha, his eldest daughter. Her face reflected a slumber of peaceful dreams, and as it scrutinized the room, he shut his eyes, for to know she had been spotted would only force her paw, and with his eyes shut in purely fictitious relaxation, he relied entirely on his other senses to warn of her next move. And he lay there, in unbroken silence for who knows how long. 5 minutes? 10, half an hour perhaps. And then finally, Raghu heard the faintest of noises, no greater than the sound of naan falling to the floor. And even with closed eyes, he could see that the room became brighter. One way or another, Shaitan was no longer on the roof. But whether it was on the ground inside or outside, he couldn't tell. Like lightning, the young father rose as silently as he could, and he surveilled the hut with an attention to detail unknown to him until that moment. Everyone else was still asleep. Nothing was out of order, and there was no sign of the intruder. Raghu breathed a sigh of relief that the beast must have slipped away into the night, when suddenly he felt as if he'd been struck by an automobile, as the beast exchanged silence for violence. Pinned to the floor with fangs in his flesh, he could gain little leverage with the machete, and just as fast as he went down, he suddenly felt himself go up. His stomach dropped as he rose. Everyone was screaming now, and even in that moment of terror, it was interesting to see his home from a perspective he'd never supposed he'd see before. The machete clattered to the floor as he used both hands to grip the log that supported the ceiling. His wife tried to hand him the blade, but he dared not release his grasp on the beams. Shaitan was strong, but surely even she wasn't strong enough to win this desperate tug of war, and though the pain was exquisite, he was confident in his grip, and thought that just maybe he'd be one of the few to survive this creature. But then the beast repositioned. The cat gripped the man's jaw, pulling in such a way that Raghu's head was being taken, regardless of whether or not there was a body attached. Instinct would not allow him to decapitate himself, and he let go, and blood rained on his wife and kids as they tried to grab him before he disappeared, replaced by a beam of moonlight that made the blood gleam like silver. And his screams grew more and more intense, even as their volume faded, until finally they disappeared altogether and were replaced by weeping. Hi, I'm Bob Gimlin. It was 1949 when Kenneth Anderson received a letter, like so many he had before. It was from a district magistrate, and as usual, the tone was desperate, imploring, and a bit derisive, as if the issue was somehow his fault. And that was all it took for him to phone his work at the British aircraft factory and inform them that he wouldn't be in for a few days, on account of an urgent hunt, and they knew what that meant. He packed his gun, torch, a change of clothes, some sandwiches and cookies, and made his way to Gummalapur, where a leopard had taken over 40 victims. And as he drove, he mulled over the letter. It was not unusual for a leopard to turn to man-eating, but this leopard, Shaitan, as the locals had named it, had a less common specialty, a signature, if you will, of pulling victims directly from their homes. More than once, without waking family members who slept right beside the victim, only to discover what happened upon waking, to find a hole in the roof, a good amount of blood, and someone gone. And it was this particularly pernicious cunning that earned the beast the name Shaitan, and they credited Shaitan as possessing either human intelligence or demonic powers, and perhaps with some consternation, Anderson couldn't help but agree with their assessment, though perhaps not quite as literally as the villagers. He knew more than one person who had been outsmarted by a cat, and they died for it, and he fully intended to take every measure possible to ensure that he would not be one of them. Anderson knew that leopards, or panthers as he more often called them, had a reputation for attacking tiger hunters at a greater rate than tigers themselves. But he believed this to be false. He knew that a territorial attack by a leopard was far less likely to prove lethal, as panthers are usually content to mangle, maul, and merely traumatize an intruder, whereas the tale of a hunter who was attacked by a tiger can only be told by an autopsy, if indeed the body is ever recovered, which Anderson notes is unlikely to happen. So he didn't think that leopards attack hunters more often than tigers. He merely thought that a hunter who was attacked by a leopard is a hell of a lot more likely to live to tell of it. However, that circumstance is in regard to attacks of a territorial nature, when a hunter or villager lingers too long in the domain of one of the beasts. Regarding attacks of the predatory kind, he notes that both the tiger and the leopard are to be equally feared, if not for slightly different reasons, which we'll get to later. Anyway, he drove a very long time to cover a relatively short distance, which he notes was perhaps the only thing he missed about Great Britain. But as usual, he could tell where the problem started. Precautions against the feline fiend began as far as word of mouth could carry. Each passing mile showed more and more buildings barred and barricaded, and these countermeasures intensified such that he could even detect the vicinities that had been in earshot of a victim's screaming. There were over 40 of them, after all. Upon beginning his investigation, Anderson was perturbed, but not surprised by the villagers' attitudes. His investigations were never well met, being an outsider and all. He said that their sense of fatalism was profound, and even admirable. Not many would speak to him, but those who did said that the leopard was the incarnation of a Shaitan, a demon, of which they believed deliverance to be impossible. They maintained that the demon would devour all who lived in this place, and arguably worse, condemn its victims to eternal torment. No, death was no way to escape a Shaitan. And true to what Anderson called pernicious Eastern fatalism, they felt that they were doomed whether they fled or not. They didn't think their fate could be altered. and many of them refused to speak to Anderson for fear that Shaitan would take that as a personal offense and single them out for it. But those who did confer with him would only speak in whispers, covering their faces, as if Shaitan would target them for a particularly brutal demise and a decidedly unpleasant afterlife experience. It was 6 p.m. and the sun was beginning to set. Anderson had gotten cozy against one of the only homes in the neighborhood that was constructed out of brick. The wall was 10 feet tall, ideal for a pouncing panther, so Anderson had taken great care to layer the roof with thorn bushes from the roadside. The brush would by no means stop the leopard, but it would prevent her from getting above him silently, which was an effective deterrent, because the leopard would never give away its location. On a blanket beside him laid a flask of tea, a canteen of water, a package of cookies, and his electric torch, and on his lap laid his rifle, cocked and loaded. In his breast pocket, matches and tobacco, and tucked between his teeth, his constant companion, a smoldering pipe, which he considered just as important as his weapon, for it kept him alert, and the weapon would be of no use if he were to fall asleep. In the drear of the coming night, Anderson had to remind himself that this so-called Shaitan was actually quite similar to non-possessed leopards, particularly in the fact that it exclusively hunted at night. In the case of tigers, no time is safer than another, but in India, leopards will not stalk under the sun. And as his watch's hands approached 7, indeed, the sun began to fall behind the hills, casting the town into a pre-sunset state, and the layers of staggered shadows brought with them a palpable sense of disconsolation. In other words, the setting sun brought doom and gloom, a sense of anxiety perceptible through the audible silence, a total and desolate blackout of noise. Sometimes there's nothing louder than the absence of sound, and as uncanny darkness conquered the landscape, the village melted into a tomb. No noise, no smells of cooking, not a single sound could be heard there, lest any soul give reason for Shaitan to strike them in particular. And though the vivid quiet was ideal for Anderson's purposes, he couldn't help but notice that the condition of the night was anything but. In fact, conditions were as unideal as possible. The clouds were too bright for stars, but still not bright enough to see, sort of like the Goldilocks and the Three Bears effect, but to the leopard's benefit, not his. With his back to brick, Anderson pondered how he vastly preferred to hunt in the jungle. The beasts and birds of the forest offered a constant source of stimulation, and not only were they entertainment, but they served as a first alert, and only when the wild chatter ceased was there reason for alarm. But here, in the human environment, the fear was constant, whether or not there was a predator at all, for in this place, all that lived was prey. In the forest, on high perches, fleet-winged birds will literally mock a leopard, but there were none of them here. From the villagers, he had learned that this leopard was a hunter of the early morning, almost always past midnight. But Anderson knew that meant that that's only when the beast would strike. He knew that cats are calculating and cunning, and never impulsive, and the hunt likely began far earlier, perhaps as soon as the sunset, which was currently underway. Or maybe it only spent the hours before midnight stalking because it had to. If someone were to say, sit on a chair in the street, perhaps then the leopard would have no reason to strike so late, with its target obvious and exposed. But the anxieties of dusk were short-lived, and by 7:30 the stars were brilliant, and the moon alone offered twice the light of a setting sun. And with visibility back on his side, Anderson ate some cookies, or biscuits, and helped himself to his pipe. This was, after all, one of the benefits of being bait. In this instance, stealth and concealment would be counterproductive. The villagers said that Shaitan was drawn to human doings, and Anderson was adept at doing human doings. By 8 o'clock, he decided to cough, a task, he notes, that grew easier with age. The cough served both to draw the leopard's attention by piquing its curiosity, as well as to appear sick and distracted, and therefore perhaps more appealing as prey. And after his throat went hoarse with coughing, he began to talk to himself, which he describes as surprisingly difficult for extended periods of time, though again, gets easier with age. He was unsure if his noise accomplished anything other than convincing the inhabitants of the village that he was either gravely ill or quite insane. After 2 hours of semi-artificial coughing and vapidly contrived dialogue, he went quiet. His Winchester, Model 1895, chambered in .405, lay in his lap, ready to be leveled at a moment's notice. Though, of course, a leopard only needs a moment. He had a large knife that he was quite fond of. It was of American make, belted over his boot, and it reminded him of those American West cowboy movies which he'd grown rather fond of. But should push come to shove, should the panther pounce upon him before he could level his rifle, he was confident he could do a good amount of damage with it. The thought of having to do so was a bit grim, but he thought he could knife a leopard. He could knife a tiger too, but it wouldn't do anything. A leopard, on the other hand, would sustain considerable damage from such a wound. The leopard would find it far more bothersome than the tiger. He wasn't sure if the leopard had spotted him or not, and this is the primary fear of all big cats. That's exactly what they want you to think. They are patience incarnate. They have a terrible talent for lowering your suspicion, often striking as soon as you turn your back to give up for the night. Not knowing if your prey is even present is all part of the game. They will not hesitate to watch prey for hours, even days before striking. Anderson sometimes believed he could feel if he'd been spotted, call it instinct or intuition, but he acknowledged that that's likely as hubris at play. But either way, he didn't feel it, so he decided to take a stroll. Carrying his flashlight and Winchester, he stalked the township, kind of a reverse Uno. At first, he mumbled to himself to attract attention, but every gap, every alley and stone wall, every shadow, every roof, it all began to overwhelm him. The roofs in particular, they concerned him the most. It would be far too easy to walk straight into a premeditated pounce. A leopard can leap 20 feet with ease, more if jumping from a high place, and it could easily do so imperceptibly to the human ear. Completely exposed, the thought of a knife fight with a leopard became notably less appealing than it had seemed a few hours ago, and he returned to his vigil, glad to have the wall to his back once more. By 2 o'clock, a cold wind came, and with it brought clouds, and visibility was entirely lost. He said he couldn't see his hand if he stretched his arm to full length. He had a blanket, but he dared not use it, for fear that the warmth and comfort would bring sleep, which is the type of victim that this particular Shaitan preferred. Shivering, he would periodically sweep the streets in front of him with his flashlight, but he eventually gave up. Flashlight or not, he wouldn't see it coming, let alone get off a shot, and he said that he was only a little surprised that he made it to morning. However, the rising sun brought an advantage. The villagers that day were far more eager to talk to him. They thought the fact that he survived, or that he hadn't fled in terror, meant that he had some sort of divine protection, and many of them also believed that his nocturnal discussions of gobbledygook were some sort of defensive spell. As he had suspected, the villagers assured him that they were quite safe during the day. This demon was bound to night. Second, they specified the 3 villages within the district of Gummalapur that comprised the leopard's hunting zone. The 3 villages that the panther called its own, one of which, of course, Anderson was currently in. They said the leopard would either take, or attempt to take, 1 or 2 people from one village within the span of 5 to 7 days before moving to the next village. Regardless of success, it never attacked in the same village more than twice, and it never hunted one village for more than a week, and it had not made an appearance in this particular village for 2 weeks. Therefore, they were expecting Shaitan any day now. In fact, they'd expected its return a couple of days ago. Anderson smirked. Demons sure seemed to be a predictable lot. And lastly, Anderson learned that the leopard had a wounded forefoot. The villagers knew this from multiple trackways they'd found. The wound didn't seem to affect its ability to hunt humans at least. But the villagers said that trackways in sand depicted that the front right foot was turned inward. This bit of intel offered valuable insight into the nature of the beast. Not so much the injury, but the fact that the villagers were able to find Shaitan's tracks at all meant she was brazen, overconfident, and not overly concerned about being hunted. He was acutely aware of the fact that if the leopard was in a state of anxiety or concerned about a counterattack, it was more than capable of not leaving any tracks at all. Which means she had not yet been given a reason to fear humans, which was good news for his purposes. As they say, naivety kills the cat, or something like that. He knew well that a bold cat is far more easily undone than a skittish cat. His mission was to teach her fear and to kill her all in one fell swoop. The last thing he wanted to do was teach her that there was something to fear and let her live to learn about it. Right now, she was a fox who had figured out how to get into the henhouse. A fox who had yet to learn how to contend with the farmer. So, since the leopard hunted 3 villages, and it never stayed in one village for more than a week, and it hadn't been in this village for 2 weeks, then Shaitan must indeed either be here or en route, meaning he didn't have to go anywhere. Thanks to the leopard's rigid routine, Anderson could stay put. And thanks to the fact that the leopard left lots of trackways to find, he knew his opponent was arrogant and incautious. So Anderson devised a plan that would be both effective and more comfortable than last night's hunt. He personally knew several hunters who met their demise due to such hubris, and despite the bravado of the characters in many of his favorite books, he knew well that a bold hunter is far more likely to be undone than a cautious hunter, and that goes both ways. So he began preparations for his more cautious plan. He claimed an abandoned hut and moved a mattress to the door and shaped a bundle of blankets into the form of a human and stuffed it with bedding, the supplies for which had been eagerly offered by the villagers. He then made a barricade of pallets and crates for himself at the far end of the hut. The blind was aimed at the dummy. He left the door ajar. It was 1 p.m, and he fell asleep. And he awoke at 6 with his plan in place. As was the case the day before, dusk brought a darkness that made functionality impossible. But once again, by 8 o'clock, the outside was bright, and he would easily be able to see anything come through the door, which was without a doubt the only unbarred door in the district at the moment. But before completing his preparations, he had instructed the inhabitants of 3 occupied huts near his trap to make noise into the night, to attract the leopard into the area. Then hopefully, once in the vicinity, it would enter his hut, as it offered the easiest access. The neighbors were understandably hesitant of this plan, not wanting to be bait themselves, but Anderson assured them that though it would be drawn to the noise, it would seek out the silence. Still skeptical, the neighbors asked what the signal should be if the leopard gets at one of them. Anderson told them not to worry, he'd know. But because of this, he remained particularly vigilant, as tonight he was not only aiming at the doorway, but was prepared to rush from his hut should screaming erupt from outside. Dutifully, the nearby residents carried on conversation late into the night, but one by one the voices faded away. And sure enough, not long after the voices went quiet, he heard rustling above him, and he prepared himself to as great an extent as one can for such an uncommon situation. Then there was silence for a long time. Then he heard the sound of something hitting the dirt floor from a height, and yet he saw nothing, so he sprang to his feet to get eyes on the beast, and in that moment, he worried that his quarry truly was a Shaitan, for as greatly as he regarded cats, he considered this to be quite an impossible entry. And he was right, for soon after, telltale squeaks identified the pouncer as a rat of considerable girth, and it made a beeline for the open door. The opportunistic vermin presented a stark reminder regarding his actual quarry. How can it be that a man-sized carnivore can indeed move with far greater stealth than a rodent of several ounces? This night was uneventful, and he fell asleep in the shadows of sunrise. And as he slept through the morning, he had no way of knowing that the following night would be one that he would recall with dread until his last day on this earth. He slept through the day, waking erratically, plagued by awful dreams that he could only remember in fragments. By late afternoon, he was awake but unrested, and wondering how this leopard was able to haunt beyond the waking world. Shaitan indeed. And as can be expected after 2 days of ideal conditions, the weather ceased cooperation, and this night was rainy, windy, and stormy, meaning he didn't expect the leopard to make an appearance. But as also can be expected, the cat cared little for expectations. By midnight, the blustering storm broke into torrential rain, and though the roof was surprisingly effective at keeping out water, the ground flooded, and his lower half was soaked. And even more discomforting was the fact that all sound was completely drowned by rain and wind. And though he suspected that the leopard would not hunt in the storm, he also knew that big cats have a remarkable talent for appearing when least expected, meaning the unlikeliness of cat activity, in a weird way, made the prospect of cat activity even more likely. Plus, due to the rigid routine, Shaitan was overdue for a meal. The rain abruptly ceased at 1 a.m., but the sky remained overcast, and it was so dark that he could scarcely make out the dummy that lay a mere matter of meters away. It was so dark, he said, that there was no difference between inside and outside of the hut. And that, my friends, is dark. His plan was entirely reliant on being able to see the silhouette of anything coming through the doorway, which, of course, required it to be brighter outside than in, and losing this advantage was devastating to the hunt. He kept having to consciously loosen his grip on the weapon, as his fingers had long ago gone numb by the powers of cold and gripping. Perhaps as a defense mechanism, he says. He fell asleep. He's not sure how long he was out, but when he awoke, he had the distinct impression that all was not well. It's a feeling that's difficult to describe, but he said you know it when you feel it. And he says that he awoke atypically, immediately alert, as if picking up exactly where he had left off, only something had changed, and he didn't know what. It was still a dark night, but enough brilliant stars peered through the haze to differentiate the doorway from the hut. He dared not look at his watch, but he knew dawn would come sooner or later. He worried that this night, too, was a lost cause. When all of a sudden, he noticed what had changed, or at least he thought he did. The dummy had moved, not by much, but it was in a slightly different orientation than before he'd fallen asleep. He wondered if this could have been the natural force of gravity, but decided against it. Then he wondered if perhaps he was mistaken, and it had been like this the whole time. But as he peered at it, trying to decide if he was crazy or not, his heart understandably skipped a beat as the dummy jerked to attention. I think we can all agree that when we're in the presence of a life-sized doll, fear is ever present, but when it moves on its own, all bets are off. True to his hunter's core, he didn't react. He merely gazed at the upright dummy, forcing himself to dispel uncanny superstitions. This dummy did not come upright through some craft of witch or demon from the ether, and this fact was made clear by an angry snarl that arose as the dummy lurched through the open door. The leopard had been so low to the ground, it had been out of Anderson's view, hidden behind the mattress which was merely a foot tall. And though Anderson heard it, he never saw it, and therefore didn't fire. Another snarl pierced the stormed-out night. This one far angrier than the first, which Anderson attributes to the beast realizing it had been duped. Cursing that he missed his shot, he flipped on his flashlight and leapt over his barricade and charged through the door. He tripped over the dummy, which had been abandoned, and he waved his torch about wildly, spinning a weak orb in all directions. He felt rather foolish, still half-soaked, almost blind, and totally exposed. Yet there he stayed for a long time, listening and watching, but he heard nothing, and saw nothing, meaning the cat was either right there or elsewhere. And though he decided that the latter was more likely, he wasn't ready to bet his life on it. And as he stood in the dark, damp twilight, he almost wished that the cat would strike him then and there, and his part in the story would be over one way or another. But of course it didn't, and of course he didn't actually want that. And it wasn't lost on him that the same hunter's intuition that had warned him that all was not well was the same intuition that warned the cat that something was different about this hut. He cursed himself for having fallen asleep. But then, maybe the cat wouldn't have come into the hut at all, as Anderson suspected that we vastly underestimate the true scope of a cat's senses. Regardless, having had eyes on it, he was more confident than ever that he would kill the killer cat. And after a few hours of sleep, he tried to track the beast in the light of day, but he found nothing in the village itself, so he checked the perimeter, and sure enough, he found tracks that crossed a muddy drainage ditch that served as a barrier between town and jungle. The tracks confirmed that the leopard was wounded. Its right forepaw only made contact on the outer edge of the paw, and this wound very well may be why the leopard turned to man-eating in the first place. Anderson also speculated that the leopard would flee this village. It knew something was up now. A hunter can sense a hunt. It takes one to know one. So Anderson decided to relocate to a village called Dvarabeta, which was the next village penciled in on the leopard's schedule. He left at 11 a.m., and though Dvarabeta was only 15 miles away, going was slow. The road was merely packed earth, and it was overgrown. The encroaching jungle slapped the doors of his Studebaker, and last night's storm had washed out much of the dirt and blocked the way with fallen trees and branches. On numerous occasions, he had to get out of the car to hack at and drag away debris, and on one such occasion, he saw the prints of a huge male tiger. Water still pooled within the printed pads, like 4 cups and a pot. Machete in hand, he He knew the blade would serve well enough against the leopard, but it would do little against a tiger. Tigers are more opportunistic than leopards. They'll hunt at night or in the day. It doesn't make much of a difference to them. The vast majority of people killed by tigers in India are taken during the day. But of course, that says more about the people's behavior than the cats. No one in their right mind goes out at night. And the poor souls who are taken during the day tend to be preoccupied with labor, which of course is precisely what Anderson was up to. The prints were the largest he'd ever seen, and he sincerely hoped he wouldn't have to come back for this tiger, and continued onwards, and he arrived at Dvarabeta at 5 p.m., and as twilight came, nearly all the inhabitants of the village entombed themselves in their shelters without a single word to Anderson, but they needn't say anything, as their actions alone were proof that he was in the right place. The plan was to do the same thing he did the first night of hunting. He found the most sturdy structure in town, and with the help of some curious young men, he layered the top with thorns. The fellows were rather keen on helping terminate the man-eater, though Anderson notes that they insisted he not help with brush collection, but instead just be ready with that rifle. Forget the leopard, they had told him. There's a tiger here the size of a Brahmin cow. Indeed, it was nearly dark by then, and it was completely dark by 8 o'clock when Anderson took his lethal vigil, and the village, though full of residents, felt as if it had been abandoned for decades. This town was much smaller than the last, and the boundary between the realms of man and animal were far less distinct. And Anderson said that this was a relief, as here, the sounds of forest could aid him in the hunt, whereas the town from last night was far more developed. No wild things lived in range to warn of a predator, be it spotted or striped. At 8:30, a sambar deer tolled its warning bellow, chiming caution to the denizens of night. Anderson thought it was too early for the leopard, and indeed he was right, as 10 minutes later, he heard the low moan of a tiger. 2 moans. Whoa! Whoa! 2 single moans, then nothing more save abject silence. The moan was not a mating call. Rather, it was merely a thoughtful noise of a tiger with little to fear, a gentle reminder to the nation of night that some beast there was going to die. The low moan wasn't a threat, it was a promise. The undisputed king had no need for stealth, as his prey knew he was there, and they knew he'd be coming. And Anderson knew that a noisy tiger is a tiger in its prime, unencumbered by competition, and unworried about achieving its next meal. The next 3 hours passed uneventfully. Anderson said that the night was so clear that he kept catching himself putting his attention to the galaxies above, because he knew it would probably be wise to focus on the street instead. And it was 11 p.m. when he saw it. A narrow, gaunt shape, loping down the street. He aimed his rifle. It was 30 yards away and walking boldly. He waited to light it up, as he didn't want to give away his position just yet. He was a fraction of a second away from pulling the trigger, and if he had, he surely would have died that night. A simple twist of fate which we'll get to later. But the beast's behavior stayed his hand. This was not the behavior of a man-eater, and certainly not that of a leopard. Regardless of situation or temperament, a leopard will never jaunt in a way for all to see, but especially not where it hunts. And even more particularly, not with a tiger in its prime within earshot. The mystery abruptly ended as the beast revealed itself. It was a dog. A pariah dog. The only dog breed unique to India. Strangely, they are a breed of dog that are actually considered a landrace breed, meaning they were never bred. They developed naturally in response to their environment, not by human selection. Meaning pariah dogs, historically, are strays, free-range, or wild, like the dingo, which is Australia's breed of landrace dog. But unlike the dingo, pariah dogs actually domesticate with humans quite well when given the option. Pariah actually means outside, a word that would later apply to India's vicious caste system, synonymous with untouchable. And though the dog's temperament brought a smile to his face, the condition of the dog wiped it away. He could make out every rib as the poor animal squinted into the beam of light. But even its emaciated face and haunches weren't enough to keep its tail from wagging, as it bashfully grinned, hesitant but hopeful to make a friend in this otherwise utterly abandoned night. Perhaps longing for company in this killing field. Perhaps the dog wondered why no one would let him inside, as he was no doubt fully aware of the unsavory character that stalks the street, Anderson was confident about this, as he notes that the dog had a, quote, very particular and uncanny wariness in his eye. And he wondered if perhaps instinct drove the dog to his side, sensing a hunter, instinctually inclined to help eliminate a threat. Besides, the best of boys are always eager to help, especially if a scritch is involved. Parasites be damned. Anderson scratched the dog, and he said that the whelp's ridiculous tail wagged with such fervor that it seemed in danger of sailing away. He gave the dog some cookies and half a sandwich. Likely, the first meal the dog had in 5 days or more. This assumption was supported by the fact that the dog promptly fell asleep and softly snored on the blanket beside Anderson's feet. The modern mind may find this counterintuitive, but Anderson was in fact an animal lover. Dogs, of course, were no exception. But pragmatically, he knew that the presence of a dog could only help with the hunt. You know what they say, bait loves company. Midnight came and went, and an eagle owl hooed, which always reminded Anderson of the souls of the dead who still wander the earth, in anguish of all the things they didn't do that they wished they had, or all the things they did and wished they hadn't. The dog stirred briefly at 1 o'clock, awoken by the sound of a sambar deer's doom in a distant swamp. The choking cries of death were followed by a triumphant, yet somehow soothing growl. The tiger made good on his promise, and had secured his dinner. And strangely, to a hunter of man-eaters, the sound of a tiger procuring a deer was somewhat comforting. The tiger was doing as it should, willing and able, meaning it was a thing of beauty rather than a thing to fear, though I suspect I'd still be a bit afraid. It had already been a clear night, but by 2:30 it was as bright as could be. The stars lit the sky, and not a single cloud was to be seen. And it was moments like this, Anderson said, that he felt for the poor saps in London. And then, from somewhere near, he heard the call of a red lapwing, or as many called it, the did-he-do-it bird. The lapwing is incapable of perching, so they nest on the ground and adamantly make their call when anything approaches. Yes, that draws attention to itself, but it also warns everything else in the area, so any predator looking for a bigger score is inclined to keep moving, kind of like a car alarm. It can't stop a thief, but it catches the attention of everyone nearby. Perhaps the lapwing was warning about the leopard, but it could have been anything else. The street dog at his feet opened a listless eye, looked at Anderson, and exchanged a content sigh for a scratch before falling back asleep. Usually, Anderson put a great deal of stock into an animal's ability to act as a barometer for danger, but looking at this, quote, ridiculous cur, he thought it very possible that this dog may, in fact, be an idiot. More time passed, and it was nearly 3 o'clock. Morning would come soon, and Anderson began to fear that this night would prove unsuccessful, which he half expected from a man-eater who had been startled the night before. The cur's satisfied sighs and full belly sounds made the notion of sleep rather appealing, and despite his best effort, Anderson drifted off to sleep, when suddenly he was awoken by a low growl. At first he thought the leopard was upon him, but it wasn't the cat growling. It was the cur at his feet. Even in that tense moment, Anderson respected the dog's instinct to alert but do so quietly, and to remain on the ground as if it had noticed nothing. This breed has dealt with leopards for millennia, and it showed. The dog still lay as if in slumber, but its hackles were drawn back, its hair stood rigid, and it trembled so that Anderson felt it through his chair. And though the dog's posture gave little indication, Anderson could intuitively tell that it was fixed on a water tank down the road, near the wood line. He stared at the spot for 5 minutes, then 10 minutes passed. Half an hour. The dog growling and vibrating the whole time. He still didn't level his gun. He didn't want to give away that he was aware of the beast's presence. And this part, according to Anderson, is the tensest moment of hunting a man-eater, because you can't give away the fact that you're prepared, which, of course, also means that you can't actually be prepared. His rifle lay on his lap. It would all come down to the draw. Can he shoulder his weapon faster than a leopard can pounce? With some unease, he realized, probably not. Maybe 20 years ago, but Anderson wasn't a young man anymore. And it was at this point that he realized that it would have been a smart idea to unbarricade the door before night had set in. The dog, still lying down, began to softly whine, which to Anderson indicated that the cur no longer knew the cat's location. which filled the dog with a, quote, most appropriate anxiety. I love these British people. Then, out of the corner of his left eye, he saw the faintest something rise and fall against the point of a nearby roof. Just an ebbing shadow. It would have been nothing to note under normal circumstances, but this was not a normal circumstance. The roof was 20 feet away, just a small hump lowering behind an edge. Anderson guessed the cat was silently stalking its way from rooftop to rooftop, preparing to come down from above, as that is the way of the leopard, a beast of the high ground. Anderson knew that it no longer mattered if the cat knew it had been spotted or not. It was too close. It was very much a single leap away, a feat that it could accomplish with preternatural silence, and there were too many rooftops to predict where it would come from. So he rose, rifle in hand, and put his back to the door, under the eave of the roof, which he said came over him by about 18 inches, inhibiting his view upward. The dog followed suit, intuiting that the ruse was up. The time for stealth and deception had passed. The dog stood beside Anderson, snarling with a ferocity that would give a tiger reason to pause, even if only for a moment. The street dog knew it was go time. He knew that death had come. As quick as he could, Anderson turned around and gave the door a swift kick, but the door didn't budge, and he dared not expose his back to the night any longer. But at least now he knew retreat was not an option. And he also knew that his best defense in terms of detecting the beast was his sense of hearing, a faculty which was rendered near useless by the dog's war cries. He muttered at the dog to shut up, and to his surprise, the dog did. 1 minute passed, 10 minutes, then 10 more, and he stood rigid the whole time. 10 more minutes, and then he heard the unmistakable sound of brush moving above him. The leopard was on the very roof which he was below, and indeed, the thorny bushel did its job. The leopard could not navigate silently. He knew that leaping backwards to get a shot at the roof would be pointless. The cat would be long gone before he could get his aim. And Anderson knew it might be a while, because cat is more patient than man. So there he stood, back against the door, in almost perfect silence for what seemed like an eternity. 10 minutes, 20, half an hour. So long that the dog lay back down, and fell into what seemed to be an uncomfortable sleep. Whether this was because it sensed that the danger was gone, sheer anxiety, or strategy, Anderson couldn't be sure. Last he'd known of the leopard's location was that it had been directly above him, and as the first couriers of dawn arrived, he decided it was most likely that the leopard sensed a trap and had moved on. However, there was no way he was about to put his back to the rooftop without clearing it first. Leopards are master sneaks, and far more persistent than tigers in this regard. His arms ached, as he'd had his rifle ready for over an hour at that point. He took a deep breath to steel himself, and hopped backwards, facing the roof and aiming for it. And though he saw nothing, he didn't expect to, whether or not it was up there at all. It could easily dip down the slope, unseen. So Anderson began to circumnavigate the roof, slowly, step by step, scrutinizing every detail, listening intently for the faintest compression on thatching, when suddenly the all-encompassing silence was broken by a great bark and snarl as the dog went wild behind him. He whirled around just in time to see the leopard bounding directly at him. All at once, the leopard leapt. The dog met her, and Anderson aimed. Mid-air, the cat ignored the dog which clung to her. No doubt, the feline was confident that it could deal with the canine once dinner was procured, which indeed she would easily be able to do. Now, if this all sounds unlikely, keep in mind that this leopard had already taken a known 42 people, at roughly 2 victims per week. That's 147 days of man-eating. Almost half a year of man-eating had not afforded her so much as a scratch. Shaitan was confident, as she had no reason not to be. All she needed was to see a back and an exposed neck, and that's precisely what Anderson offered her when he turned to clear the roof. The beasts were in the air. One roared through a mouthful of fur, and the other was silent as is its nature. Anderson pulled the trigger, and both animals slammed into the wall of the house. The Shaitan began to make a grunting sound that Anderson said was unique in all his years of hunting. He said it was strangely akin to the way a bodybuilder grunts or exclaims while lifting weights. The cat rose to flee, but struggled to do so as the dog, though motionless, still clenched the scruff of her neck. Realizing she was being gripped, the cat bit the dog, but the dog didn't let go. Anderson aimed again, and again the cat tried to retreat, but she couldn't, so she tried to bite the dog once more, but instead she bled out and died. It was fortunate that the dog bit her where he did. He connected too high on her neck for her to bite his neck, and even once clearly destroyed, the dog's jaws stayed locked on Shaitan. His tail wagged triumphantly, as if he'd done this all by himself. He had sustained some scratches and a bite wound. Other than a limp he carried for a couple of months, there was no lasting damage. And if you were to ask the dog, he would surely say that the injuries he endured were more than worth it in exchange for a lifetime of scratches, biscuits, and adventures in India with his new best friend and master, Kenneth Anderson. Anderson concludes his saga of the Leopard of Gummalapur with writing, quote, "I took the cur home, washed and fed him, and named him Nipper. Nipper has been with me many years since, and never have I had reason to regret giving him the few biscuits and sandwich that won his staunch little heart and caused him to repay that small debt within a couple of hours by saving my life." The Leopard of Gummalapur killed a known 42 people. If anything, it's more, not less. She was a female. Anderson never weighed her, or specifically commented on her weight, but female leopards are nearly half the size of males, only averaging between 64 and 75 pounds, or 29 to 34 kilograms, which to me is astounding, astoundingly chilling to think of a mammal so small, but still so dangerous. To put that in perspective, this leopard was likely the size of Homus. One Homus weighs 68 pounds, which is smack dab in the center of the female leopard weight range. I look at my dog and, it's hard to work that one out. At most, she had 10 pounds on this guy, though there's a chance she had 10 pounds less. But no doubt, she had a lot more lank and a lot less chunk. I'm a pretty average guy, I'd say, and the beast that literally ripped some 40 people through their own roofs was significantly less than half my weight. But of course, a creature like this is all muscle and cunning, and hunger, though obviously the people she was going after were probably a great deal slighter than me. She had a wounded forepaw, and Anderson had supposed that the wound had been caused by a tool of the trapper's trade, or perhaps a bullet, or at least by a human trying to defend themselves. But further examination revealed that the injury had actually been caused by a porcupine quill, a quill that never came out, and was still in her at the time of her death. And though the wound had healed before the time of her death, there was evidence of a dramatic infection that left the foot partially deformed. A recent cholera epidemic had killed many, and Anderson speculates that improperly disposed bodies may have helped her survive her foot infection, as likely she wouldn't have been able to hunt. And of course, this very well may have caused her to see humans as prey. So he attributes her man-eating, quote, habit to her injury, improperly disposed bodies, as well as the presence of a very large male tiger. She probably was only in this area at all because no other leopard wanted it, because of the tiger, and the tiger's constant marking probably terrified her, and trained her to hunt where the tiger would not, which of course was in areas of human habitation. Anderson said that on paper, if you are to listen to the hunters in the bars, it may seem like more hunters are attacked by leopards than by tigers, but he refutes this. He said it only seems like that, because a hunter is far more likely to live to tell about a leopard attack, whereas the poor soul who finds himself in the jaws of a tiger, well, they've told their last story. When a tiger thinks you're too close for comfort, the mauling is lethal, whereas a leopard is usually content to merely mangle, traumatize, and otherwise humiliate you for life. But that's in reference to territorial attacks. Regarding attacks of the predatory kind, Anderson asserts that the leopard is capable of equal, if not more terrible, cunning and killing prowess than the tiger, and this is because the leopard requires far less water and far less room to roam than the tiger, meaning, of course, that the leopard is more likely to be where you least expect it, such as an alley or in your bedroom. For my North American friends, at least, think of the tiger like a black bear and the leopard like a raccoon. One is just more brazen and gets more comfortable where it ought not to be. And if indeed a leopard is out of its environment, it's probably hungry, and it probably doesn't expect to find any deer, and it's not there for your trash cans. Furthermore, Anderson asserts that leopards have a keener sense of self-preservation than tigers. And this makes sense. Obviously, something like a leopard has more reason to be paranoid than something like a tiger. By the time a tiger's fully grown, it's not afraid of too much. The same cannot be said for a leopard. Both these big cats have to contend with the Himalayan brown bear, Indian wolves, crocodiles, hyenas, and sloth bears. And whereas the tiger can, almost without exception, always intimidate or fight its way to dominance, the leopard prefers to use its considerable powers of sneak. Also, I think it's kind of funny. There's literally one forest in the West where a small population of Asiatic lions still subsist. And imagine being the only leopard on the continent that has to deal with the pride of lions. There's one leopard out there dealing with lions and he doesn't know it's unusual. But anyway, indeed, Anderson has an almost supernatural regard for the leopard's sense of self-preservation. He also notes that leopards will foray far deeper into human habitation than tigers will. And this is entirely due to the leopard's ability to move unseen, a skill that even a tiger can't pull off in a city or a town. Tigers are just too big. Furthermore, it is not unheard of, or even particularly rare, for a leopard to claim a habituated settlement or town as his or her territory. And you might think, but wouldn't all the human doings deter him or her? Well, not if you sleep all day and come out at midnight. You know, I start my day at 2 a.m., and it's not because I'm a morning person. But anyway, sometimes it's the little ones you have to look out for, and that was the case of the leopard of Gummalapur, a leopard with 42 recorded human fatalities to its unholy tally, and likely a few more that, like all the rest, are nameless here forevermore. It's hard, for me at least, to rank leopards with lions and tigers and bears, though of course they deserve it. But the reason it's hard to list the leopard among these literal heavyweights is a simple matter of size. Again, Anderson didn't weigh her, but he doesn't mention that she was particularly large or small, and he usually does if it's the case. So she was probably between 55 and 65 pounds, or right around 30 kilograms. I'm going to be honest here. It wasn't until I almost finished this whole project that I realized just how small this leopard was. This is way too big, in this illustration. Again, my dog weighs 68 pounds, so she was likely actually smaller than him. And it's almost scarier to think of it being so small. A commonly passed about bit of trivia is that leopards can haul 3 times their weight up into a tree. Or through a roof, I suppose. 60 times 3 is 180. That's more than enough to haul me. Now, this was in Africa, but this African leopard tried to take the man in the photo, a man named Carl Akeley. Look how small it is. But he did manage to dispatch it, with his bare hands in a nearby rock, I believe. You know, in bear terms, a 60-pound bear is called cute. That's about a 7-month-old black bear, and still entirely dependent on its mother. And this narrative is such a poignant example of how such a relatively small predator can prove so lethal. Behavior, behavior, behavior. This leopard would not strike from the front. It'll wait days until it sees an exposed back. A leopard will not attack in a predatory way if you can see it. It went to great lengths to wait until Anderson's back was turned. I have an extremely healthy respect for the threat animals pose. But even I'm inclined to say that an average person, such as myself, with a halfway decent weapon, like a knife, an axe, or broadsword, should be able to terminate, or at least dissuade, a 70-pound animal. But that's the thing that this narrative proves. This leopard will only attack under ideal conditions. The leopard will not attack if it's been spotted. The leopard will not attack from the front, and I tried to illustrate this in the opening sequence. A machete should prove quite devastating against a leopard. Unless, of course, it comes from behind and pins you on your belly, which, of course, is exactly what it does. The leopard goes for the neck, not the throat. And if you're flat on your stomach, with weight on your back and fangs in your spine, your weapon may as well be a potato. I think leopards strike a particular fear in me, because, if I'm attending to my labors, and I get jumped by a lion or a tiger, I know I'm done. I'm going to scream and struggle and get eaten and mutilated. But if I get jumped by a 70-pound leopard, I'm going to see hope. But I guess that's in terms of a territorial attack, because if it was predatory, I wouldn't even know what hit me. But either way, I'm going to fight. I'm going to fight like hell, and I'm probably still going to lose. It's hard to imagine losing a fight to a mammal significantly less than half my weight. But then, I've been sent into full retreat by stray cats. I always try to pet them. I can't not. 70 pounds isn't big, but it's more than 2 bobcats. And I would not want to fight 2.5 bobcats. I wouldn't want to fight 0.25 bobcats, let alone 2.5 bobcats. Back to the relationship between tigers and leopards. I love it. I was researching their interactions because their ranges overlap in much of India and Nepal. And I found this one article that said, tigers and leopards have developed strategies to minimize conflict. I then read on to learn that the strategy consists of the leopard running for its life because tigers hunt and kill them as rivals. I just thought the premise of the article was rather silly. You know, my survival strategy is to not take naps on train tracks. But seriously, this graphic here, this is incorrect in terms of a predatory attack. When this happens in reality, it's dark. I can't see. But it can. And I've been watched for hours, if not days, if not passively for weeks or even months. It knows my habits. It knows my routine. It knows where I might turn around and where I won't. It knows what I can see. It knows what I can hear. I'm walking, and then suddenly, I'm hit, and I'm hit hard. And I'm on the ground, winded, gasping for breath. But it's hard to get a breath in because something's on my neck, and it won't come off. And it's wet. Some of that's blood, but it started as something else. Then there's the sensation of moving, laterally first, across the ground. But then it's up and over something, perhaps a fence or a fallen log, followed by the feeling of falling, and then forward again, into the woods. Then it gets even darker, as the moon is blocked by trees. I hear heavy breathing. Every act of resistance, however feeble and futile, is met by a snarl and a stiff shake that sends currents of agony down my spine. And from there, it only gets worse. This is the fate of some 35 to 100 people, annually, in India. Anyway, make sure to like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and as always, thanks an awful lot for listening.